The first thing my mother did when she spotted me near the entrance was glance around to see who had noticed. Not at me. At the people behind me. The donors. The investors. The university trustees. The people whose opinions mattered. Then she lowered her voice and said, "Claire, this really isn't your kind of crowd." The ballroom lights reflected off crystal chandeliers overhead. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters moved through the room carrying silver trays of champagne. And my mother looked at me like I was a stain on a white tablecloth. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. I hadn't. "You came anyway?" she asked. Not hello. Not nice to see you. Not thank you for driving 3 hours. Just that. You came anyway? I felt several nearby guests glance toward us before quickly pretending not to listen. My father appeared beside her. His expression tightened immediately. Exactly the same expression he'd worn my entire adult life whenever someone mentioned what I did for a living. "Claire," he said. One word. Like a warning. Like I'd already caused trouble. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt. Because at that exact moment, scattered throughout the room, sitting on cocktail tables and tucked under guests' arms, were copies of the most talked-about novel in the country. A novel half the room had read. A novel several guests had already spent the evening discussing. A novel that had sold millions of copies. A novel I wrote. Nobody in my family knew that. Not my mother. Not my father. Not my younger brother. Not even the relatives who claimed they knew everything about everyone. The woman standing in front of them, the woman they still described as between careers whenever anyone asked about me, was the author whose book had become impossible to escape. And somehow they had no idea. My mother folded her arms. "You could have at least called first." I stared at her. The string quartet continued playing. Champagne glasses clinked. People laughed nearby. And standing in the middle of all that elegance, I realized something strange. For the first time in years, I wasn't nervous. Usually these interactions left me exhausted, defensive, embarrassed. Tonight felt different. Maybe because I had finally stopped needing anything from them. Maybe because a secret has a peculiar way of making insults lose their weight. Especially when the people insulting you have absolutely no idea who they're talking to. "Claire?" My mother was still waiting. Still irritated. Still worried I might embarrass her. I smiled politely. "No need to worry." My father frowned. "What does that mean?" I looked around the ballroom. At the guests. At the books. At the stage. At the banners displaying the name of the charity gala my parents had spent months preparing. Then I answered honestly. "It means tonight probably won't go the way you expect." My mother immediately interpreted that as a threat. Her face hardened. "Please don't start anything." I nodded. I wasn't planning to. And the funny thing was, that was completely true. A few questions were already hanging in the air. Why did my parents think I was such a disappointment? Why didn't they know what I actually did? How had I managed to hide something that's successful for so long? And, most importantly, why was my book suddenly everywhere at the exact event they had begged me not to attend? Those answers started months earlier. Long before that ballroom. Long before the guests began connecting names. Long before the woman giving the keynote speech walked into the room carrying a hardcover copy of my novel. And long before my mother discovered the worst possible truth. She had spent the entire evening praising my work, without realizing it belonged to me. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 36 years old. I live in a small town outside Madison, Wisconsin, with my husband Ethan and our 7-year-old daughter, Ava. If you asked my parents what I did for a living before that gala, they'd probably have said something like, "Oh," Claire writes. The way people say, "Oh, he collects stamps." Or, "She makes candles." A harmless hobby. Something cute. Something temporary. Never something serious. Never something worthy of respect. The strange part is that my parents weren't cruel people in the traditional sense. They weren't screaming parents. They weren't abusive. They didn't throw things. They didn't insult me every day. What they did was subtler. And, honestly, harder to explain. They simply decided who I was 20 years ago and never updated the information. No matter what happened afterward. To them, I was always the sensitive child. The impractical child. The dreamer. The one who never quite figured life out. Meanwhile, my younger brother Ryan became the success story. Ryan was 32. Handsome. Confident. Loud. Exactly the kind of person who made strong first impressions. People loved Ryan within 5 minutes of meeting him. My parents loved introducing him. My mother practically glowed when she talked about him. Ryan had worked in marketing, then consulting, then branding, then entrepreneurship, then executive coaching, then something involving cryptocurrency, then something else. Honestly, I lost track. The details changed every year. The admiration never did. Meanwhile, I quietly paid my bills, quietly raised my daughter, wrote books, quietly built a career nobody bothered to ask about. And over time something strange happened. The less interested they became in my life, the easier it became to hide it. Not intentionally at first, just naturally. For example, 5 years earlier my second novel had appeared on a national bestseller list. My mother called 3 days later. She wanted to know whether Ryan's new company website looked professional. The conversation lasted 42 minutes. She talked about Ryan for 38 of them, then asked if Ava still liked dinosaurs. Then hung up, never once mentioning the bestseller list. Never because she was being mean, because she genuinely didn't know. And she didn't know because she never asked. That pattern repeated for years. A book launch. No questions. A literary award. Foreign publishing deals. Television interviews. No questions. At first I tried. I'd bring things up. Then I'd watch their eyes glaze over. Just disinterested. Eventually I stopped. By the time my fourth novel became a phenomenon, my family had already trained themselves not to look too closely, which made everything easier, including the pen name. The pen name happened almost by accident. 8 years earlier, my agent suggested it. We were just trying to make the books stand out. So Claire Bennett became Evelyn Hart. A simple name. Easy to remember. Easy to market. Easy to separate from real life. At the time it felt practical. Years later it became something else entirely. Protection. A wall. A door I controlled. When readers loved the books, they loved Evelyn Hart. When critics praised them, they praised Evelyn Hart. When television hosts discussed them, they discussed Evelyn Hart. My real life stayed untouched. Private. Peaceful. Far away from cameras. Far away from publicity. Far away from people who had spent decades telling me writing wasn't a real career. And honestly, I liked it that way. Until the new book happened. Everything changed with the new book. The Last Summer Letter. That was the title. Nobody, not even my publisher, expected what happened next. The novel exploded. Book clubs. National television. Podcasts. Interviews. University discussions. Reading groups. It seemed like everyone was talking about it. Within 6 months, it was everywhere. Within a year, it was one of the best-selling novels in the country. Then came the award nominations. Then came the film offers. Then came the attention. A lot of attention. Enough attention that journalists started becoming curious. Who was Evelyn Hart? Why was nobody seeing her? Why were there almost no public appearances? Why did she avoid photographs? At first it seemed harmless. Then it started becoming harder to manage. Especially because one particular person became obsessed with finding me. Margaret Sinclair. If you read books, you knew her name. Everyone did. Margaret ran one of the largest literary foundations in America. Winning one of her awards could change a writer's entire career. And for nearly a year, she publicly praised The Last Summer Letter every chance she got. She talked about it constantly, recommended it constantly, quoted it constantly. Then she started saying something else. She wanted to meet the author, the real one. The search became almost a running joke in publishing circles. Journalists wrote articles about it. Podcasters discussed it. Readers speculated online. Meanwhile, I kept writing. Quietly. Privately. Exactly the way I always had. Until 6 weeks before the gala. That's when my mother's text arrived. And everything started moving toward collision. The family group chat had been silent for nearly a year. Then suddenly, Mom, important update regarding the gala. The annual Bennett Foundation fundraiser was my parents' biggest event every year. Doctors, attorneys, university donors, business owners, politicians, people my parents admired, whose approval mattered. My mother continued typing. We need everyone presenting their best professional image. Ryan immediately responded. Of course. Several relatives added thumbs-up emojis. Then came the final message, the one directed specifically at me. Claire, maybe this year it's better if you sit this one out. I stared at the screen, then typed, excuse me. Then another message appeared. Mom, we just don't want awkward conversations about your career situation. I read it 3 times. Career situation. I laughed, because it was funny. At that exact moment, my latest royalty statement sat unopened beside me. The amount on it was more money than my father had earned in several years. And my mother thought my career situation might embarrass them. I showed Ethan. He read it, read it again, then slowly lowered the phone. Wow. Yep. Do they honestly not know? I shook my head. No. Not even a little? No. He stared at me, then laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. And for the first time, I started wondering whether keeping the secret had become impossible. Because something was coming. I could feel it. The attention around Evelyn Hart was growing too quickly. The questions were getting louder. The investigations were getting deeper. Sooner or later someone was going to connect the dots. And when they did, my family wasn't ready for what they were about to learn. The week after my mother's text, I made a mistake. I answered a phone call. It was my Aunt Linda, my mother's older sister. A woman who collected information the way some people collected antique jewelry. Every family has one. The person who somehow knows everyone's business. The person who always sounds concerned. The person who accidentally spreads news to 50 people before lunch. She called on a Tuesday afternoon. I was finishing edits on a manuscript. Ava was still at school. Claire, sweetheart. The sympathy in her voice immediately raised every alarm bell I had. Hi, Aunt Linda. How are you holding up? I blinked. Holding up. A very small pause. The kind people make when they accidentally reveal something. Oh. You don't know. I set my laptop aside. Know what? What don't I know? Aunt Linda hesitated, then sighed. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. Which, in Aunt Linda language, meant she absolutely intended to say something. Aunt Linda. Your mother mentioned you've been having a difficult time? I closed my eyes. Difficult how? Financially. I laughed. Actually laughed. Out loud. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. My latest royalty deposit alone could have purchased my parent house. What exactly did she say? Claire, what exactly did she say? Linda lowered her voice. She said writing never really worked out. I stared at the kitchen wall. The silence stretched. Then she continued. She said Ethan was carrying most of the burden. She said things have been difficult for years. 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 My mother had apparently been telling people this for years. Meanwhile, Ethan and I had paid off our mortgage, invested carefully, bought property, funded charities, paid every bill. Yet somewhere in my mother's version of reality, I was still struggling. I see, I said. Claire, honey, I never believed it. That was kind, possibly even true. But it wasn't really the point. The point was that my mother did. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. Not angry, not even surprised, mostly tired. My mother hadn't merely ignored my success. She'd replaced it, created an alternative version of me. 3 days later, Ryan proved exactly how deep the problem had become. My cousin Melissa invited everyone to dinner. A casual family gathering. Nothing formal, just relatives. 20 people around a long table. I decided I was tired of hiding from situations other people created. So Ethan and I drove over. The moment we arrived, Ryan was already holding court. As usual, half the table was listening to him explain something involving investors, or branding, or consulting. Honestly, I wasn't sure. The details changed every time. The confidence never did. Claire. Ryan waved dramatically. There she is. Several relatives turned. I smiled. Hi, Ryan. Still writing. There it was. Immediately. Not hello. Not how's Ava. Not how have you been. Still writing? Like asking whether somebody still played guitar on weekends. Yes. Good for you. He nodded approvingly. The way someone might encourage a child. You've got to keep pursuing your passions. A few people chuckled. Not maliciously. Just socially. Following his lead. Ryan loved audiences. And audiences loved Ryan. Then he turned toward a businessman sitting nearby. Claire's always been creative. The businessman smiled politely. Ryan continued. Never cared much about money. I watched him. Completely calm. Completely sincere. As if he genuinely believed what he was saying. That's the thing about family narratives. Eventually people stop lying. They start believing. Ryan wasn't performing. Ryan honestly thought he was describing reality. The problem was reality had left him behind years ago. The businessman nodded. That's admirable. Ryan laughed. Trust me. Somebody in every family has to be practical. The table laughed again. Then Ryan lifted his wine glass. Luckily that's me. More laughter. The moment passed. The conversation moved on. But something important happened inside me. Something shifted. For years comments like that would have hurt. This time they didn't. Because suddenly I understood something. Ryan wasn't talking about me. He was talking about a version of me that existed entirely in his head. A version frozen in time. 23 years old. Unpublished. Uncertain. Still asking permission. That woman didn't exist anymore. Hadn't existed for a very long time. The only person who hadn't noticed was Ryan. And soon, a lot of people were about to notice. The next crack appeared a week later. My agent called. Rebecca Lawson. Tough. Brilliant. Terrifying when necessary. The kind of woman who could negotiate six-figure contracts before breakfast. And somehow still remember everyone's birthday. Tell me you're sitting down. That was how she opened the call. I'm sitting. Good. A pause. Then, Margaret Sinclair is attending your parents' gala. I nearly dropped my coffee. What? You heard me. I sat upright. The annual fundraiser suddenly felt a lot less ordinary. Margaret Sinclair didn't attend random events. Her schedule was impossible. People waited months just to get 15 minutes with her. So, why was she attending my parents' fundraiser? Rebecca answered before I asked. Your mother's been donating to the foundation. I blinked. That actually made sense. Very much my mother's style. Strategic philanthropy. Network building. Relationship cultivation. She probably saw Margaret as another valuable connection. Another important person. Another step upward. Unfortunately, Margaret's current obsession happened to be finding me. Rebecca laughed. You realize how insane this is? I do. No, Claire. I don't think you do. She sounded delighted. Your mother invited the one person in America most determined to identify Evelyn Hart. I rubbed my forehead. When she put it that way, the situation sounded ridiculous. And there's more. Of course there was. There are rumors. What rumors? The foundation may announce the Literary Excellence Prize that same evening. I froze. Now things were becoming dangerous. Because the last summer letter was the favorite. Everyone knew it. The nomination alone had generated headlines. If the award happened that night, and reporters were already investigating, and Margaret Sinclair was there, and my family was there, suddenly several collision courses were intersecting at once. Rebecca spoke more quietly. I need you prepared. For what? The possibility that someone else reveals your identity first. That thought stayed with me long after the call ended. Because for years I'd controlled the timing, the narrative, the privacy, the distance. Now control was slipping. Slowly, but definitely. And the closer the gala got, the more inevitable everything felt. Like watching a storm approach across open water. You can't stop it. You can only decide where you'll stand when it arrives. 2 nights before the fundraiser, my mother called. A rare event. She sounded stressed, frazzled, anxious. Claire. Hi, Mom. We're finalizing seating. I waited. We really think it's best if you don't attend. Straight to the point. No hesitation. No apology. Just elimination. Again. I looked out the kitchen window. The sun was setting. Ava was drawing pictures at the dining table. Ethan was making dinner. The normal life my parents barely knew existed. Why? A pause. Then honesty. At least partial honesty. Because important people will be there. I almost smiled. There it was. The entire philosophy. Condensed into one sentence. Important people. As if importance was something assigned by invitation lists. As if worth could be measured by banquet seating. As if the people reading my books across the country somehow counted less than the people drinking champagne at her fundraiser. I understand. You do? Yes. She sounded relieved. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that would replay in my mind for weeks afterward. You've always been happier doing your own little thing anyway. Your own little thing. 8 years. 5 novels. Millions of readers. National recognition. Awards. Film negotiations. Translations. Interviews. And somehow all of it remained. Your little thing. I realized then that no revelation would ever truly surprise my mother. Because she wasn't missing information. She was protecting a belief. And people defend beliefs far more fiercely than facts. Good night, Mom. Good night, sweetheart. When the call ended, I stared at my phone. Then I laughed quietly. Because 3 days later the entire foundation of those beliefs was about to crack. And neither of us knew it yet. By 6 o'clock on the night of the fundraiser, my parents were already winning. The ballroom occupied the top floor of the Lakeshore Grand, a hotel overlooking downtown Madison. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 sides of the room. The city lights reflected off the glass. A jazz trio played near the stage. Servers circulated with champagne. My parents stood near the entrance greeting guests. My mother wore a silver evening gown she'd spent months choosing. My father wore a custom tuxedo. Ryan moved through the crowd like a politician working a campaign trail. Handshakes, back slaps, loud laughter, business cards, the usual. Ryan spent nearly an hour introducing himself as someone with major publishing opportunities developing. Around 7 o'clock, Margaret Sinclair arrived, and the atmosphere changed instantly. People noticed. They always did. Margaret had that effect. She wasn't flashy, wasn't loud, didn't demand attention. But somehow attention followed her anyway. She was in her early 60s. Sharp-eyed. Composed. The kind of woman who seemed to evaluate an entire room before accepting a single handshake. My mother practically floated toward her. Margaret, we're honored. Margaret smiled politely. Thank you for inviting me. My father joined them. Several board members drifted closer. Within minutes, a small circle had formed. Meanwhile, something else was happening throughout the ballroom. Something neither of them noticed. Copies of the last summer letter kept appearing. On tables. In handbags. Under chairs. In guests' hands. Everywhere. The novel had become impossible to escape. One woman had brought hers hoping Margaret might sign it. Another guest was discussing a chapter during cocktails. A retired judge was debating the ending with his wife. A university dean mentioned assigning it to students. Everywhere Margaret walked, somebody referenced the book. Eventually she laughed. I don't think I've attended an event all year where this novel didn't come up. It's wonderful. Margaret nodded. It is. Then her expression softened. I still think Evelyn Hart is one of the most extraordinary writers working today. Several guests agreed immediately. My mother nodded too, enthusiastically, not realizing she was praising her own daughter. Again, someone asked whether Margaret had ever met the author. No. Still. No. Unfortunately, Evelyn Hart remains very elusive. My mother laughed. Maybe she's hiding. Margaret smiled faintly. Or maybe she wants privacy, or she spent her life around people who never bothered looking closely. Across the room, Ryan was busy creating his own problems. He'd cornered a publishing executive. A real one. Unfortunately, Ryan didn't know that. He thought she was simply another donor, which meant he spent 10 minutes explaining the publishing industry to someone who had worked inside it for 25 years. Several nearby guests later described the conversation as painful. So you're involved in publishing? Ryan asked. A little. The executive smiled. A little? Ryan laughed. I'm actually working on something huge myself. Oh. Still confidential. Of course. But let's just say I've had several serious conversations. The executive nodded politely. What kind of book? Ryan hesitated. Apparently, he hadn't expected follow-up questions. Well, a literary project. The executive smiled. What genre? Ryan froze. A few seconds passed. Then, contemporary. Interesting. She sipped her champagne. Commercial contemporary or literary contemporary? Ryan blinked. The woman beside them started looking suspiciously entertained. Ryan tried recovering. Honestly, labels aren't important. The executive nearly laughed. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Not because Ryan chose to leave, because everyone else did. At 7:30, my phone rang. Rebecca, my agent. I stepped outside onto my back patio before answering. The evening air was cool. Please tell me you're dressed. I laughed. I'm wearing jeans. Rebecca groaned. Claire. What? You're impossible. What happened? A pause. Then. Reporters found something. My stomach tightened. What? The copyright filings. Because I immediately understood what that meant. The filings contained my legal name. Not Evelyn Hart. Not the pen name. Mine. Rebecca continued. The information isn't public yet. Yet. How long? Maybe hours. I looked toward the darkening sky. The storm I'd been sensing for months suddenly felt very close. Very real. Very unavoidable. Back inside the ballroom, Margaret Sinclair was beginning to notice something. Not evidence. Not proof. Just inconsistencies. Tiny ones. The kind experienced people notice instinctively. For example, my parents never mentioned me. Not once. They discussed Ryan repeatedly. His business. His plans. His future. His projects. Everything Ryan. But their daughter Claire barely existed, which struck Margaret as odd, especially after learning there were 2 children. Not 1. 2. Whenever Claire's name appeared, the conversation shifted. Changed. Margaret noticed. Eventually she asked, directly, so, what does Claire do? The question landed like a stone in water. Small, but noticeable. My mother smiled. That practice smile. The one she used when explaining me. Oh, Claire writes. Mostly creative projects. Creative projects. Not novels. Not books. Not publishing. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Professionally? My mother hesitated. A fraction too long. Then, she's always been very artistic. What kind of writing? My father jumped in. Nothing major. Margaret looked at him. A few minutes later, she drifted away from the group. Not because she was offended, because she was curious. Then came the first major crack. A retired professor approached Margaret holding a copy of The Last Summer Letter. Wonderful novel. Margaret smiled. It is. The professor nodded. You know what always fascinated me? What? The family. The family fascinates everyone. The professor tapped the cover. Because it feels real. Margaret agreed. Then the professor added. The mother especially. Margaret smiled knowingly. The mother is unforgettable. The professor glanced across the ballroom. Toward my mother. Then back to Margaret. Then toward my mother again. A strange look crossed his face. What is it? The professor hesitated. Oh, nothing. Professor. It's ridiculous. What is? The mother in the novel reminds me of someone. Margaret followed his gaze. Straight to my mother. And suddenly, for the first time all evening, Margaret stopped smiling. At that exact moment, 3 different reporters received the same notification. The copyright investigation had been confirmed. The legal identity behind Evelyn Hart had been verified. The article was being prepared. Publication imminent. Minutes away. Not days. Not hours. Nobody inside the ballroom knew it yet. Not my parents. Not Ryan. Not the guests. Not even Margaret Sinclair. And within the next 30 minutes, the entire room would begin seeing my family differently. At 8:12 p.m., the first phone lit up. Nobody noticed. One notification in a ballroom full of 200 people wasn't unusual. A businessman glanced down, read something, frowned, then looked across the room. A few seconds later, another phone buzzed. Then another. Then 3 more. The jazz trio continued playing. Champagne continued flowing. Conversations continued. For about 30 seconds. Then the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically. Not all at once. More like a current moving through water. Something unseen spreading from table to table. People reading. Looking up. Looking around. Reading again. Trying to reconcile what they were seeing with where they were standing. 3 hours away, I sat in my living room staring at the same article. The headline was simple. Best-selling author Evelyn Hart identified after years of speculation. Below it, Claire Bennett of Wisconsin confirmed as the writer behind the last summer letter. My legal name. My photograph. My biography. Everything. The secret was over. Not exposed maliciously. Not leaked. Not stolen. Just found. The way truths eventually get found when enough people start looking. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen. No panic. No relief. No excitement. Just stillness. After 8 years, the door had finally opened. My phone rang. Rebecca. Again. You've seen it? Yes. It's everywhere. I believed her. Publishing moved fast. Social media moved faster. The article had been live less than 5 minutes. Already thousands of people were sharing it. Already journalists were reposting it. Already television producers were calling. Already people were discovering who Evelyn Hart really was, including a ballroom full of people my parents had invited. What's happening at the gala? I asked. Rebecca laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the situation had become unbelievable. Chaos. That was all she said initially. Just chaos. Then, Margaret saw it. What did she do? Nothing. A pause. That's what terrified everyone. Apparently, Margaret Sinclair had been speaking with donors when her assistant quietly handed her a phone. Margaret looked down. Read the article. Read it again. Then went completely silent. Then she asked one question. Only one. Where's Claire Bennett tonight? Nobody answered immediately. Because nobody knew. Or, at least nobody important knew. My mother finally stepped forward, trying to remain composed, trying to stay in control, trying desperately to understand why half the room suddenly looked at her differently. Claire wasn't able to attend. Margaret looked directly at her for several long seconds, then asked, Wasn't able? My mother smiled nervously. She preferred not to come. Margaret didn't reply. Around them, guests were reading, comparing information, making connections, finding interviews, finding photographs, finding articles, finding quotes. The same realization kept spreading. The daughter they never talked about. The daughter who wasn't present. The daughter who supposedly struggled with her career. That daughter was Evelyn Hart. A university dean was the first person brave enough to say it aloud. Wait. The word carried farther than he intended. He looked toward my parents, then toward the article, then back again. Claire Bennett. What exactly does Claire write? Someone asked. Nobody responded. Another voice. The article says she's sold over 5 million copies. Another. There's a film adaptation coming. Another. Didn't she just receive the National Literary Excellence Award nomination? The questions kept coming, one after another, each one dismantling years of assumptions, years of stories, years of carefully maintained narratives. Across the ballroom, Ryan was experiencing his own disaster. His sponsor had just read the article. The same sponsor Ryan had spent weeks trying to impress. The same sponsor he'd spent the evening telling exaggerated stories to. The same sponsor he'd repeatedly implied was witnessing the success story of the Bennett family. Unfortunately, the sponsor now understood something. Ryan wasn't the success story. Not even close. Sponsor approached him quietly. What exactly does your sister do? Ryan laughed, still unaware. Claire? Yes. She's a writer. The sponsor stared. A writer? Yeah. A smile. A shrug. Then the sponsor held up his phone. Ryan looked. And everything changed. Blank. The expression people wear when reality suddenly refuses to match memory. No. That was apparently the first thing he said. Just, no. Then, that's impossible. Then, somebody made a mistake. The sponsor didn't argue. Because the article contained contracts, awards, publishing records, photographs, evidence, facts. Meanwhile, my mother was beginning to unravel. Cracks were appearing. Small ones. Visible ones. Because guests had started asking questions she couldn't answer. When was her first book published? How many novels has she written? Did you know she was nominated? Did you read the latest one before publication? Questions a supportive parent could answer instantly. My mother couldn't, because she genuinely didn't know. And people were starting to notice. Margaret too. Eventually she called Rebecca, my agent. The call lasted less than 5 minutes. But afterward Margaret understood everything she needed to understand. Not every detail. Just enough. Enough to see the shape of the story. Enough to recognize what had happened. Enough to realize why the author of the last summer letter never spoke publicly about family. At 8:40 my phone rang again. This time it was my cousin Melissa. The moment I answered, I heard noise. Lots of noise. Ballroom noise. Voices. Confusion. Movement. Claire. What happened? I almost laughed. That's a broad question. No, seriously. She lowered her voice. Nobody knew. I know. They really didn't know. Ava was upstairs watching a movie. Ethan was reading. Your mom's freaking out. That didn't surprise me. What about Dad? Silent. And Ryan? Melissa laughed. I don't think Ryan's spoken for 10 minutes. Then she said something that stayed with me. Something I hadn't expected. Claire? Yeah. They don't look angry. I frowned. What do you mean? They look scared. For years my parents had controlled the narrative, the assumptions. Now strangers were rewriting those assumptions in real time. A few minutes later Rebecca called. Margaret wants to know if you're coming. I looked toward Ethan. He already knew the question. I could tell from his face. Coming where? You know where. The gala. The ballroom. The room where my parents had spent months building a perfect image. The room where the guests now knew who I was. The room where everyone was waiting. Claire. Rebecca's voice softened. You don't owe anyone an appearance. You don't owe anyone a confrontation. I know. You don't owe anyone forgiveness. I know. A pause. Then, but if you want the truth spoken by the right person, she let the sentence hang. I looked at Ethan. He closed his book. What do you want to do? I thought about that. Really thought about it. The answer came easily. I stood, walked toward the kitchen, picked up my keys, then looked back at Ethan. Let's go. He stood up, smiled back at me, and said, Sure, but not like this. It's gonna be your first public appearance and a viral moment. You have 10 minutes. I actually got ready in 15 minutes, a long radiant ET classy dress with a minimal makeup and elegant hairstyle. The drive to Madison took just under 40 minutes. For years I'd chosen silence. Not fear. Not weakness. Silence. There is a difference. Silence is a choice. Being silenced is not. Tonight, for the first time, I was choosing something else. The Lakeshore Grand came into view around 9:20. The parking lot was still packed. The fundraiser was clearly still going. Local reporters had started arriving. Not many. Just enough. Enough to confirm that something unusual was happening. As Ethan parked, he looked over at me. You okay? I nodded. Actually, yes. And surprisingly, I was. We entered through the main lobby. People recognized me immediately. That was strange. A few whispered. A few smiled. One woman quietly held up a copy of the last summer letter. I smiled back. The elevator ride felt longer than it actually was. 20 floors. A soft instrumental version of some pop song. Mirrored walls. My reflection staring back at me. Then the doors opened. The ballroom went silent. Not instantly, but close. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. People noticed. Then more people noticed. Then everyone noticed. The room parted almost automatically. People stepping aside. People looking at the woman whose book had occupied their conversations for over a year. I hadn't expected that. Honestly, it made me uncomfortable. I wasn't there to be celebrated. I was there because I was tired of being absent from my own story. The first person who moved was Margaret Sinclair. She crossed the ballroom before anyone else could. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just direct purpose. When she reached me, she smiled. Then she extended her hand. Claire Bennett. Margaret. The room watched. Every eye followed us. Margaret looked at me for a moment, then said, "I've spent 18 months trying to find Evelyn Hart. Turns out she was easier to find than I thought." The room relaxed slightly. The tension broke. For a moment. Then Margaret did something nobody expected. She turned toward the crowd. "Before anything else, I would like to congratulate Claire on tonight's Literary Excellence Award." Applause erupted immediately. Real applause. I stood there feeling awkward and grateful and overwhelmed all at once. Because despite everything that had happened, the readers had always been kind. Then I saw my parents, standing near the back, frozen. My mother looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days. My father looked 10 years older than he had a month earlier. Ryan looked like he desperately wanted the floor to open underneath him. For a second, none of us moved. Then I walked toward them. Not quickly. Not aggressively. Just calmly. The crowd parted again. My mother spoke first. "Claire." Her voice cracked. I stopped a few feet away. Close enough to talk. "Why didn't you tell us?" The question almost made me laugh. After everything. After years of dismissal. After years of assumptions. After years of not asking. That was her question. "When would I have told you?" She blinked. "What? When would you have listened?" "Whenever I tried, you pushed me away. You never asked about my work yourself. You just assumed that I am some broke writer who's not worthy of being listened to or talked about." I kept my voice calm. "You never asked what I was writing." My mother looked stunned. "You never asked who my publisher was. You never asked how many books I'd written." My father stared at the floor. The guests weren't watching a confrontation. That was the strange thing. They were watching a realization. A family discovering things they should have known years ago. My mother finally found her voice. "We thought," then stopped. Because whatever came next would sound terrible. "We thought what? That I failed? That I couldn't succeed? That writing wasn't real? That I wasn't worth asking about?" "I know what you thought." I said it gently. Not cruelly. Just truthfully. "I've known for a long time." Ryan suddenly stepped forward. "Claire." His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You should have told me." As if you actually had time to listen to me, rather than bragging about our plans. I counter-questioned. His expression changed. Confusion. Then memory. Then embarrassment. Because suddenly he remembered every time he'd interrupted. Every joke. Across the room, several guests quietly looked away. Not because the situation was uncomfortable, because it felt private. Then my father finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm proud of you." Even I wasn't expecting that. I studied him carefully, trying to decide whether he meant it. And for the first time all night, I believed him. A little. Not completely. My mother started crying. Real tears this time. I missed everything. The words escaped before she could stop them. Then another. And I didn't even know I was missing it. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Margaret stepped onto the stage. Not to rescue anyone. Not to interrupt. Simply because the evening still needed to continue. Awards still needed presenting. Announcements still needed making. Before heading toward the stage, I looked at my parents one final time. I'm not angry anymore. That surprised them. It surprised me too. Because it was true. Anger requires energy. And I'd stopped carrying that weight years ago. But things don't go back to normal. My mother nodded immediately. She understood. For once, she actually understood. Then I turned and walked away. Not because I was rejecting them, because the conversation was finished. At least for tonight. 6 months later, the film adaptation moved into production. The award brought new opportunities. Book sales increased again. Life became busier than ever. But strangely, the biggest changes weren't professional. They were personal. My father started calling once a month. Never long conversations. Never emotional conversations. But real ones. The kind we'd never had before. Ryan eventually apologized at a proper apology. Not an excuse disguised as an apology. A real one. It took time. My mother changed the slowest. Not because she didn't care, because people spend decades becoming themselves. Change takes longer than regret. Not everything was repaired. Some things never fully are. But the relationships that remained became more honest. Today, the framed royalty statement hangs beside my writing desk. Not because of the money, because it reminds me of something important. You don't need permission to become who you already are. Not from parents. Not from family. Not from anyone. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most simply haven't updated their picture of you in years. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop posing for it. So tell me, was Claire right to keep her success private? Would you have forgiven the parents? And if you were standing in that ballroom, what would you have said? Let me know in the comments. If you stayed with me till now, like and subscribe the channel. It's free and worth it. Thanks for listening, folks.